Hello everybody and welcome back to a brand new video from me, Pickles Parker Reviews. Now, in my opinion, Doctor Who has a villain problem, and it sort of relates to returning villains, or the idea of returning villains. Now, Doctor Who as a show is famous for its villains and monsters. There's a reason why the phrase "hide behind the sofa" is so synonymous with Doctor Who, because over the years it's had a habit of frightening children and having some of the best antagonists in all of sci-fi. Iconic villains such as the Daleks, the Cybermen, and the Master, to name three. However, the issue is that ultimately, those three of many that I just mentioned are really the only iconic monsters of Doctor Who that even return in the show. In any show, if you've got antagonists, you're going to have returning antagonists. Villains that aren't just a one and done, particularly when you're doing stories that are very much monster of the week, you're going to have villains that come back again, either because they're popular or just because they're so good that there's more story potential to get out of these villains rather than the one plot that you did with them initially. It's a core part of how shows like Doctor Who work. However, one thing Doctor Who has been sorely lacking in is a variety of returning villains. It very rarely has villains returning, and when it does, it's only one of these three: Daleks, Cybermen, and Master. And it's been this way practically ever since Peter Capaldi became the Doctor, and that issue has gone through into the Whittaker era. However, Doctor Who Flux aired a few days ago on Sunday, and in my opinion, this can really break the returning of villains curse. Now, this isn't all about the idea of returning villains. You can have a great villain that doesn't return, but my point is that Doctor Who hasn't been creating villains to return, and therefore, because they're not created with the intention to return, they ultimately aren't that good because they're not created with the substance to think this is a good villain that has loads of substance that we could bring back. They're creating them purely for a one and done-esque scenario, so therefore they're not going to add much substance to it. I'm going to speak about the classic series because even though we speak about the Daleks, the Cybermen, and the Master, ultimately the classic series had a raft of returning villains. Yes, ultimately it was still that main three in terms of, you know, your core returning villains, but they also had the Sontarans, they had the Silurians, the Ice Warriors, the Rani, the Mara, and I'm bound to be forgetting some others as well. But there were loads of returning villains in the classic series, and even great villains that were more of a one-done-esque scenario. I'm mostly talking about the Philip Hinchcliffe era, you know, Magnus Greel, Krynoids, Axons, Sutek, Sharaz Jek, you know, the Candyman. I know people don't really like the Candyman, but I think he's pretty cool. The Celestial Toymaker. All these different characters in the classic series who are more of a one and done type thing, but they still worked amazingly well. Morbius as well. Davros, who is one that I neglected to mention, but he was also a big returning villain as well. So ultimately you had your host of returning villains who would return in different stories, but you also had your one and done villains. Omega as well as another one and done villain. You see, I'm thinking of more and more as I'm speaking because there were just so many. But I think the reason why the classic series was able to do one and done villains that worked and were amazing but remained one and done is because I think the classic series structured stories are very different to how particularly Chris Chibnall structures his stories. I think a lot of the thought process behind the classic series stories was, let's think of a really cool idea for a monster and then build a story around that. So, for an example, the Krynoids, for example, they thought this is a really cool idea of the Krynoids, a plant monster that takes over people and uses their bodies as hosts. That's a really cool idea. So let's take that idea for a monster and create a really compelling story around it, and ultimately you get the Seeds of Doom from that. Whereas in the modern series, the Capaldi era, I think, and then Chris Chibnall's Who especially, is very much, let's think of a plot, and then the monster is more of an afterthought. So for example, Nikola Tesla's Knives of Terror. Let's think of a really cool story involving Nikola Tesla and history, and oh, we need a monster. So after coming up with this idea, let's think of a monster that can fit into that. And I'm not necessarily saying that's terrible or even the wrong way to do it. If anything, that should be the right way to do it. But ultimately, I think that the classic series stories weren't exactly putting the plot to one side of focusing on the villain, because if you've got such a good villain, you can probably make a really compelling story around that. The thing is with Chibnall's stories is, he's thinking of the story, and he's in his mind, he's sort of thinking, well, Doctor Who needs a monster, so let's just chuck a monster in there. And ultimately, the monsters end up being quite serviceable, but they're nothing special, because they're merely there to service the story. But they're Skiffer and Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. They're fine, they're serviceable, they work in the story, but on their own, there's really nothing to them, and I could describe every single Chibnall era villain or monster in that way. They're fine, they're serviceable, but you're not going to remember them in T-1 day, and that's because they've got nothing special about them, because they're merely there to work in this story and be the very familiar piece to a wider narrative, rather than be the main draw-in of the story. And I think that results in worse and lesser concept villains. You've got villains with very generic and low effort concepts just to fit into the story, and therefore you're never going to get any returning villains from these. You're never going to get a villain and say, oh, that's a villain that is so high concept that there's so many more stories you could do with that. Or you're not going to get a villain that is, hey, this villain is super popular, let's bring them back, because they're just so nothingness. I know people said that Chris Chibnall had a villain problem in Series 11 especially, and I think that's because he structured his stories in this way. Whereas in the classic series, it was very much, hey, let's think of a really cool idea for a villain and make a story around it. And that's why you get so many villains that are memorable, even though they were a one and done, because ultimately they were such cool concepts for villains that ultimately they're still memorable. And also they're not really one and dones, because they were so memorable and cool that there's definitely been a ton of expanded media doing sequels for them. I'm talking Big Finish and audios and novels, for example. People like the Kreyns and Sutek did return, just not in the show. Then what's the case with the Daleks and the Cybermen, the Sontarans, and all these characters? Well, ultimately they were conjured up the same way, thinking of the monster first, the story second. And ultimately they were so popular, or there was more material with them, that they were brought back. Now I think the problem with the current show is ultimately the only characters it wants to bring back are established monsters, Daleks, Cybermen and Master. There's even been a reluctancy to bring in other returning monsters from the classic series or just the modern series. People like the Sontarans, the Silurians, the Ice Warriors, who were brought back from the classic series to the modern series and only had one or two stories. Now I know the Sontarans are returning in Flux, but ultimately this is the first fully fledged Sontaran story you'd imagine next week since 2008, which was their big triumphant return to the Doctor Who since the classic series in David Tennant's era. It's the same with the Silurians, one story in the modern era, Ice Warriors, 2 stories in the modern era, Zygons, 2 stories in the modern era. You get my point, that ultimately even these so-called good returning monsters don't really get brought back. They just bring back the Dalek, Cybermen, Master, the old reliable 3. But I think the issue is that ultimately you're scrambling for stories with these villains because they've been used so much that practically everything that can be done has been done with these villains. Ultimately it's extremely hard to create a good Dalek story that's really cool and inventive, which is ultimately why the 2 Chris Chibnall Dalek stories, Resolution and Revolution of the Daleks, feel so generic and like you've seen them before. Because ultimately, what new things can you do with the Daleks? Chris Chibnall's only reusing them because they're recognisable, not because he has a really cool story to tell with them. And I think also the thing is these finales all get very predictable, very samey. It feels like we've seen the last finale involving the Cybermen and the Master 3 times. It's because we have. And I think ultimately you not only get very weak villains for most of the series, but ultimately your returning villains end up getting quite boring and quite stale. Now, in my opinion, they should dabble more with people like the Sontarans, those lesser known returning villains, and really build them up, because there's cool ideas you can do with them. But ultimately also, it needs to start creating its own returning villains. New villains with really cool ideas that can really come back. Ultimately, the only new villains in the modern series that wasn't carried over from the classic series that become returning villains all sort of came from the RTD era. I'm talking about people like the Ood, I'm talking about people like the Jadoon, the Weeping Angels especially. And that's because Russell had a tendency to create new villains, because he knew that Doctor Who, one of its biggest draws was its monsters, and ultimately you need to be creating new threats for the kids to love, ultimately, and be scared by. So he had a tendency to make new villains, and obviously pairing with Stephen Moffat, the absolute monster magician that he was, for creating really interesting monsters with amazing concepts, not too dissimilar from many iconic villains from the classic series that had cool concepts. You know, that was a dream come true. There's a reason why the only returning villains we really get are from the RTD era, and that, they're all from the Moffat era as well. It's because of that. It's because since, I'd argue, the Smith era, showrunners haven't really attempted to create their own villains and build them up. They've just gone the old reliable three, and that ends up in really boring storytelling. And ultimately, the Weeping Angel is a bit of an interesting case, because I was watching Blink last year for my marathon, and ultimately it struck me just how little the Weeping Angels and their gimmick really features in this story. It's less of, oh, angels scary, don't blink, or they'll get you, statues all, and it's more of, this is a really interesting story about time and events in the wrong order, and you being sent back from the present to the past, and then you've got to try and relay information from the past to the present without any time travel technology. It's a really interesting time story, using a really weird narrative, and the Weeping Angels are merely scary villains that are serviceable in the story to communicate this message. It's far more interested in what the angels do when they get you than all the angels are going to get to you. And the Weeping Angels are really a small part of that story. But because they were popular, they came back, and The Time of Angels is a story that Moffat said, hey, the Weeping Angels were popular, but let's take away most of the story of Blink in terms of they zap you back in time. Take away that, so the story isn't revolving around on that idea, it's primarily revolving around the idea of the angels are scary and they're gonna get you. So therefore you're then creating a story out of the angels, rather than this is a cool time story and the angels are kind of serviceable. It strikes to me more so what Chibnall does with his stories, just that Moffat has such a brilliant and inventive brain that even when creating serviceable monsters, they have such a cool concept that ultimately they're so popular and amazing that ultimately you can then bring them back and make them bigger and more integral and have a story strictly about them, and it still works. Now, Moffat was a great example of this, and I'd argue that he was on the road to creating iconic villains just like the classic series, people like the Weeping Angels, the Vashta Nerada, on a similar level to people like Sontar and Silurians. In his own era, he only really had the Silence. Just remember, because I think about the Moffat era, Great Intelligence, another recurring classic series monster. But yes, he had the Silence, and that's a bit of a weird case as well, because you can argue that he had this whole arc of the Silence will fall, and ultimately the concept of the Silence came second, the arc came first. But ultimately, whereas, it's debatable, were the Silence and the idea of them, the design, the concept of you forget them when you look away, did that come first, or the story? I'd argue the plot arc of the Doctor dying in the Silence religious order probably came first, but ultimately it's Moffat again trying to create a new iconic Doctor Who monster. I even remember getting Doctor Who Adventures, and they were talking about the big four Doctor Who villains, obviously monsters I mean, so the Master wasn't involved, and it was Daleks, Cybermen, yep, Weeping Angels, yeah, they'd appeared quite a lot up until this point, so yeah, they're probably in the top 3 of what the public and general people would consider big Doctor Who villains, and the silence were. And I remember they had rating systems out of 10 for how scary they were out of the 4. Weeping Angels 8 out of 10, Cybermen 9 out of 10, Silence, Daleks both 10 out of 10. And even though I don't agree with that rating, that just goes to show how hard they were pushing the Silence to be all this massive Doctor Who villain. They're going to rival the best. But I think because the Doctor dying arc sort of went off a cliff after Series 6 in terms of its involvement, Moffat kind of dropped it, the Silence just sort of seeped into the background, and they became so attached to this arc because he never had them involved in the story when it wasn't, that ultimately they stopped being returning monsters outside of the Smith era, which personally I think is a big shame, because I think disconnected from the organisation and the Doctor dying and Silence Will Fall, ultimately their idea and design has the potential to be a big returning villain, and there's loads of stories you could do with that ultimately it's a shame they were never brought back. But that almost feels as if the last attempt to really make a big returning and effective Doctor Who monster. In the Capaldi era you had monsters like the Boneless, which I think are a great example of a one and done Doctor Who villain. You can't really do anything more with them, but they're great and an amazing idea from Matheson in Flatline. But ultimately, you don't really get too many really good returning villains, or even one and done villains. I think in the Capaldi era, it started to seep into that Chibnall way of let's story first, monster is very much if it's serviceable that's fine, and then we didn't really get any really iconic returning villains. The Monks actually was another attempt to create more of a big Doctor Who villain, but ultimately that sort of fell flat on its face, mainly because apart from a look, there's nothing interesting to them, and the Monk Treaty wasn't a great set of stories anyway. So then the Capaldi era and the Chibnall era, probably due to, I wouldn't say the failure of the Silence, but not quite going as Moffat had planned, ultimately you get less original monsters that are really good, and less returning monsters even from the classic series. You have the odd little one in the Moffat era, in the Capaldi era. Obviously Matt Smith, you've got Silurians and Ice Warriors and also Zygons, and you haven't had a classic series monster come back into the modern series since 2013 with the Zygons. I think that's quite telling as to where this production team has gone in terms of returning villains and big villains that can hold a story on their own. And yeah, we haven't really had a big scale villain since then. They've all sort of been one and done, just serviceable, not interesting villains from Capaldi into the Whittaker era, and ultimately we've then been stuck with the big three, Daleks, Cybermen, Master, which makes finales really uninteresting, because yeah, we know how this is going to play out. It's just going to spin a roulette wheel. It's going to be one of those three, if not more than one of those three. And yeah, it just lends an air of predictability and stillness. I love these three villains, don't get me wrong, but it seems as if writers are struggling to find a good example to use them and a great story, which I think there are good stories you can tell with these villains, but I think we need to have a writer who has that idea, rather than just using them for the sake of using them. And I think you can tell in Chibnall's scripts especially, that ultimately he really has no amazing ideas to tell with these villains. So yes, that makes the whole Rose Gallery of Doctor Who villains feel particularly small. Now we're getting the Weeping Angels and Sontarans back. I'm glad about that in Flux, because even though they're not original villains, it's increasing that roster from just the main three to others that you're putting up higher. Obviously we've had the Judoon as well, but they're more of a smaller part in Series 12, and now we're getting these. But again, you're not getting that sense of original villains. This is where I think Doctor Who Flux comes in. You're probably wondering, why am I even making this video? It's because Doctor Who Flux aired on Monday, and we were introduced to the Swarm and Azure. Monsters and characters that look really cool. By the way, the whole skull and almost Hammer Horror-esque design with these is very unnerving. It just feels like they went balls to the wall with the design. It looks really cool. Their voices are really creepy. The design, as I say, cool and very creative. I love the just weirdness of them. The main guy, Swarm, with his purpley skull crystalline face, but then he's wearing a black and gold suit with massive shoulder pads. I love the bizarreness of this. And yeah, Azure's blue face is really cool, and Swarm, that's an interesting name. It looks like it's almost made of little apart, so that's probably why it's made up of a swarm. It's many separate entities making up one big one, and it has a past to the Doctor. He has a past with the Time Lords, presumably. Maybe he is a Time Lord or some relation, and he's really sinister. He's got a very sinister voice. I love the visions he's making, and ultimately I love that Azure bit with Dan's love interest, Diane, in which that really great horror-inspired sequence in which he's dragged into the house. They're really creepy. It looks like they're going to be playing a very big role in Flux, and it strikes me as, yes, we've got the Flux, but these villains have so much to them that to me, surely they must have come first and then part of the story second. I love that from Chibnall. I've been saying that I want Chibnall to go out there with his ideas. It feels like he's really said, yes, I'm going to give you a really amazing villain. I not only think that these could work really well in this story and be remembered as one of the best one and done villains in Doctor Who, if they're really cool, then ultimately I think they could return. Perhaps because this is a Chibnall villain and we're getting RTD soon, maybe not. And I have a feeling they will be one and done, but I still think that they can have a really good impact and break that code of great original villains for the show. I think they could have the potential to return. We'll have to wait and see what happens at the end of Flux, but if they remain as interesting as they are at the moment, I think we could have a really great original villain on my hands. Is it just these two, or are there more? If it's a whole species, then yeah, I think we could definitely have a great returning villain. But even so, I think this is going to be a great one and done original monster, and breaking the curse that I think has haunted Doctor Who and its array of villains for a good few years now. Maybe even about 10 years, to be honest with you. Yes, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then hit like and hit subscribe if you want to see more Doctor Who content. I'll be doing a weekly reactions to new episodes of Doctor Who Flux as they come out. So my episode reaction to War of the Sontarans should be coming out Sunday evening, this Sunday. I know that ultimately my Halloween Apocalypse reaction came out on Monday instead. That's because I had a lot of homework to do, and ultimately that sort of takes priority. But ultimately, I imagine that this Sunday I'll be able to get it out on Sunday. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And I also want to get back into making Doctor Who videos and making videos in general. I think that my enthusiasm with Doctor Who correlates in terms of how much I post on this channel. Even though this channel isn't a strictly Doctor Who channel, Doctor Who and my passion for making videos sort of go hand in hand. And with Doctor Who coming back and me getting that passion for the show back again, I've now got more of a passion to make videos, so hopefully I'll be making more videos in between these initial reactions, as I've got some more ideas for what videos I could make. If you want to see that, then stay tuned for that and subscribe. And yes, what did you think of this video? Do you agree that Doctor Who has a villain problem? Do you agree with that statement? Do you not? Do you think that Swarm and Azure could almost break the curse of villains that Doctor Who has been going for the last 9-10 years? Whatever you think, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts, and let's begin a discussion. That's always fun. But yes, thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.